Before we begin, I want you to do something simple that has become an essential part of examining cases like this one. Leave a comment with where you're watching from and the exact time on your clock at this moment. We keep track of when and where these documented accounts resurface because, over time, patterns have a way of emerging. Patterns in geography, patterns in timing, and patterns in the kinds of stories that choose their moment to arrive on particular screens in particular rooms. Fix your place, fix your time, and then we'll fix another. The year was 1938, in a town that, on paper, could have been almost anywhere in the American Northeast. Tree-lined streets, modest factories, church spires rising above rows of narrow houses built at the turn of the century. A place where the worst trouble most people could point to came in the form of occasional labor disputes, heavy winters, and rumors of faraway war that hadn't yet reached their daughters and sons. The house that concerns us stood near the edge of that town's older district, where the streets narrowed and the sidewalks heaved just slightly from decades of frost and thaw. It was a three-story structure with a mansard roof and a narrow front porch, built in the 1880s when coal delivery still came by. Horse and wagon and basements were deep, cold spaces meant as much for storage and furnaces as they were for shelter from summer heat. In the autumn of 1938, that house acquired new owners, a family of 5 looking for more space than their cramped apartment over a shop could provide. They were not remarkable as individuals. Their names, ages, and occupations appear in the surviving records the way so many do, on property deeds, school enrollment forms, and church rosters. What matters for our purposes is not who they were in their daily lives, but what they found beneath their new home, and the questions that discovery would raise for everyone who stepped into that basement afterward. On paper, the sale of the house was unremarkable. The previous owner, an elderly widower, had died that spring. His surviving relatives, living in another state, were eager to dispose of the property quickly. The price was favorable. The house needed work, but nothing that couldn't be addressed gradually. Peeling exterior paint, outdated fixtures, and a roof that would require attention within a few years. The realtor's notes from September of that year described the basement in a single line. Full stone cellar, typical of the period, accessible from interior stair. Nothing more. No mention of anything unusual. No hint that, within weeks, that space would become the focus of a police investigation, an architectural survey, and, eventually, the kind of quiet, local folklore that persists long after official records go silent. The first weeks in the house followed a pattern many families would recognize. Furniture was carried in on borrowed trucks, boxes stacked and opened. Children exploring unfamiliar rooms, claiming corners and windows as their own. The furnace, a hulking cast-iron unit in the basement, demanded early attention as autumn air sharpened. A local handyman was brought in to inspect the system, clear soot from the flue, and verify that the old pipes running up into the floors could survive another winter. His receipt, preserved in a folder decades later, lists the ordinary tasks of his trade. Clean furnace, test draft, replace cracked grate. There is no note yet of anything amiss. The first indication that something was wrong, or more precisely, that something was present that should not be, appeared not in any official document, but in a private record. A page from a personal diary kept by the woman of the house. The entry, dated October 11, 1938, contains a line that would later be quoted in investigative notes. "I am almost certain there is a door in the basement wall that was not there yesterday." At first glance, it reads like an expression of anxiety, the kind of fleeting unease that can accompany a move into an older structure with unfamiliar angles and shadows. In the days that followed, however, that single line would take on weight because others would confirm seeing what she described. According to that diary, she noticed the change while carrying down a crate of canning jars. The basement, accessed by a narrow wooden staircase off the kitchen, was lit by a single bulb hanging from a long cord. The space felt as many basements of that era did, cool, damp, and smelling faintly of coal dust, old wood, and earth. Against one wall stood the furnace, its pipes reaching overhead like rigid blackened branches. The opposite wall, constructed of rough mortared stone, had been bare when she'd first toured the house with the realtor. An unbroken surface, interrupted only by a narrow window well high near the ceiling. On that October afternoon, however, she noticed something else. There, in the stone wall, where she was certain she had seen only rough blocks a week earlier, stood what appeared to be a door. It was narrow, scarcely wider than a person's shoulders, and noticeably shorter than a standard interior door, forcing an adult to stoop in order to pass through. Its surface was of dark, unfinished wood, marked by vertical grain lines and small circular knots. There was no decorative molding, no frame in the conventional sense. Instead, the wood seemed to sit directly against stone, as if someone had carved out a rough opening and set the panel into it without bothering to conceal the transition. There was no knob, only an iron latch, heavily tarnished. The woman would later write that her first reaction was not fear but irritation with herself. She assumed she had simply failed to notice the door earlier, distracted by the furnace inspection and the clutter of moving. She set down the crate, tugged the pull chain for the bulb to angle the light toward the wall, and stepped closer. The stone surrounding the door was darker than the rest of the wall, the mortar fresher by decades. You did not need to be a mason to see that the opening had been altered at some point after the original construction. Still, there were practical possibilities: a coal chute once bricked over and then reopened, a storage alcove, and an access point to old plumbing. Older homes often bore the accumulated improvisations of earlier owners. She touched the door. The wood felt colder than it should have, even accounting for the chill of the basement. The latch resisted slightly before moving, with a dry, metallic sound. When she pulled, the door did not open. It did not rattle in its frame or budge against some visible obstruction. It simply refused, as if the wood were not attached to hinges at all, but were a solid piece fixed into place. That might have been the end of it. A curious detail to mention over dinner, then gradually forget amid the more pressing work of settling in. But that night, she brought it up to her husband, expecting him to dismiss her concern with a practical explanation. Instead, according to his later statement to local authorities, he went pale. "There is no door in that wall," he reportedly said. "I would have noticed. I was down there 2 days ago checking for leaks. It's just stone." The next evening, after the children had gone to bed, they went down together. The bulb flicked on. The furnace loomed. The rough stone wall awaited them. And there, unmistakable now to both of them, stood the narrow door. What unsettled them most in that moment was not the door itself, but the way it seemed to resist belonging to the rest of the space. It had no architectural lineage, no carpenter's logic, and no sign it had ever been part of the original design. It sat there in the basement wall like an afterthought, or worse, an intrusion. Something inserted rather than built. The husband examined the edges with the kind of slow, methodical care reserved for tasks one does not entirely trust. He pressed his thumb along the seam where wood met stone. No draft, no give, no indication of hinges. He tried the latch. The metal moved with more reluctance than force, as though it had not been touched in decades. The door did not open. They returned upstairs without speaking much, each trying to privately reconcile the same impossible detail. A door neither of them remembered, appearing where no door should have been, set into masonry, clearly older than both of them combined. That night, after the house settled into the quiet rhythms that come only after children fall asleep and adults grow still, the husband went back downstairs alone. The diary mentions hearing the creak of the basement steps, then silence for several minutes, then his return. He said nothing. It is unclear whether he found something he chose not to share, or whether the quiet weight of uncertainty had simply become too heavy to put into words. The next entry in the diary is dated October 14th. The handwriting is sharper, as if written with a firmer hand. He agrees now that the door was not there before, but neither of us can explain how it appeared. He thinks we should speak to someone. The someone in question was the local building inspector, a man familiar with the quirks of older homes in that district. His recollection, documented in later statements, describes the basement as structurally sound but peculiar in layout. He noted the furnace, the stone walls, the narrow windows, and he noted the door. His report contains a line circled in pencil. The door does not appear original to the structure, not listed on prior inspection from the last owner. When asked whether the previous owner might have installed it late in life, the inspector said the stonework around it had been modified at least several decades earlier, likely before the man had even purchased the home. Whatever the door was, it predated the previous owner. That raised an immediate problem. There were no known records of any structural changes to the basement for more than 40 years. The inspector tested the latch. The door held firm. He pressed along the edges, checking for concealed hinges or a hidden catch, but found none. He tapped the wood lightly with the handle of his flashlight. The sound was dull and muted, suggesting thickness well beyond that of an interior panel. "Feels more like the back of a crate than a door," he wrote. While the inspector was not known for dramatics, his report contains one detail unusual for such documentation: an expression of uncertainty. He wrote that the door did not seem intended for regular use. When asked what he meant, he could not elaborate, only that it felt less like an entryway and more like a closure, something meant to keep something out, or keep something in. On October 15th, the husband contacted a mason from a nearby town, someone recommended by neighbors as particularly knowledgeable about older stonework. The mason arrived late in the afternoon, lantern in hand. His expertise is documented not in official reports, but in an interview recorded decades later by a local historian researching unusual cases of early 20th century architecture. According to that interview, the mason immediately recognized that the stones surrounding the door did not match the rest of the foundation. Different quarry source, different cutting marks, different mortar composition. "This wasn't built with the house," he told the family. "Someone altered it long after the foundation went in." He estimated the alteration had occurred sometime in the early 1900s. When told that the house had only 2 known owners in that period, both of whom had died long before the current family arrived, he reportedly grew quiet. The mason attempted to determine whether the door opened inward or outward. It opened neither. The edges were fixed against the stone, as if someone had wedged it in place from behind. When he pressed his ear against the wood, listening for the faint resonances that usually reveal whether there's open space behind a barrier, he heard nothing. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. Old stone basements rarely offered perfect silence. Pipes hummed, air shifted, foundations settled. Even sealed crawl spaces carried the faintest traces of ambient sound. But the door gave nothing. "Dead quiet," he later told the historian. "Like there was no space there at all, like the wood sat against a void." The mason recommended removing the door entirely, not because he believed it dangerous, but because its presence was structurally inconsistent. Before doing so, he offered to return the next day with tools and a helper, but he would never get the chance. According to the diary entry from that evening, the husband went downstairs around 9:30 after the children had fallen asleep. He told his wife he wanted to get one more look before the mason returned. She heard the basement door open, the stairs creak, and then silence. Several minutes passed, longer than she expected. She descended only after calling his name twice and receiving no reply. When she reached the bottom step, the single bulb flickered, then steadied. Her husband stood before the door, unmoving, his hand resting on the latch. When she asked what he was doing, he answered without turning, "It moved." Those 2 words became the axis on which the entire case would later turn. Because according to every official record, every witness account, and every surviving document, the door had no hinges. The door had no joints. The door had no mechanism at all by which it could have moved. Yet that night, he insisted it had shifted just slightly, as though responding to his touch. The wife, terrified, demanded they go upstairs. He followed without argument. Neither returned to the basement again that night. But the next morning, Something else would force them back downstairs. Something neither of them could explain. Something that would ultimately draw law enforcement, architects, and investigators into a place none of them could fully understand. Because by morning, the latch on the door, tarnished, stiff, and resistant to motion, was no longer in its usual position. It was standing upright, as if recently lifted by a hand. The latch standing upright should have been impossible. The metal had resisted even the inspector's attempts to move it. The mason had needed both hands to coax it half an inch. Yet there it was, at dawn, straight and rigid, as if recently handled by someone with enough precision and force to lift it without scraping the oxidized metal against the wood. The wife's diary describes her reaction in a single line. "Nothing in this house makes sense anymore." According to later interviews with investigators, the husband did not initially believe this was cause for alarm. He suggested the metal might have shifted naturally as temperatures changed, or that perhaps he had nudged it unintentionally the night before. But the explanation didn't hold. The wife reminded him of the sound it had made, an audible resistance that suggested stiffness and age. Latches like that did not simply lift themselves. When the mason returned later that morning with tools in tow, he immediately noticed the latch. His notes, kept in a pocket notebook he used for estimates and measurements, record the moment bluntly. "Latch up on arrival. Not possible." He asked whether either member of the household had moved it. Both denied touching it since his visit the day before. The mason then attempted to return the latch to its lowered position. It fought him again, resisting, until he applied concentrated pressure. He stepped back, frowning. "It shouldn't do that," he muttered, more to himself than to the family. Then, with both homeowners observing, he set to work removing the door. His plan was simple. Wedge a pry bar along the seam, loosen the frame, and pull the door free of the stone enclosure. But from the first strike, something was wrong. The wood didn't behave like wood. It didn't splinter or crack. It didn't flex under pressure. The pry bar pressed into it with the same dull, resistant quietness one might expect from thick, dense material, not timber. He tapped his knuckles along the surface as he had done the day prior. Again, that muted sound, heavy, uniform. He called for his helper to bring a drill. The drill bit, a hardened steel tip used for thick lumber, met resistance almost immediately. The bit whined, slowed, and halted. He tried again with a different angle. Same result. "Feels like I'm drilling into stone," he said, stepping back, confusion visible even decades later in the historian's recording of the interview. He leaned close, examining the grain. It looked like wood. It felt like wood. It simply didn't behave like it. Convinced the job was beyond his expertise, the mason advised them to contact someone specializing in older structures. Before leaving, he offered one final assessment. The door was not original, but whatever had been used to construct it was unlike anything he recognized. Denser, quieter, and more resistant than expected. After he left, the family considered their next course of action. The wife wanted to leave the house until they could get answers. The husband argued for caution rather than panic. They compromised by agreeing not to go into the basement unless absolutely necessary, and to keep the children away from the lower level entirely. That resolution was held for 3 days. On October 19th, according to the diary, the couple was awakened at 2:23 in the morning by a sound both would later describe as a deep knock, muffled as though from behind a wall. The sound came once, then again, then stopped. They stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for more. None came. At dawn, despite their agreement, the husband descended into the basement. The wife followed moments later. The first thing they noticed was the smell. The diary describes it as faint, metallic, and not unlike the scent of old tools or damp stone. It had not been present the night before. The second thing they noticed was the latch. It was upright again. When the husband tried to move it back down, it resisted with the same stiffness as before. The diary notes that he pressed it twice, once gently, once firmly, before stepping back, shaking his head. "Something's back there," he said. Whether he meant an animal, a person, or simply the concept of a hidden space, the diary does not clarify. But whatever he believed, he was troubled enough to contact the local authorities. The responding officer, whose later report is stored in an archive, approached the matter with measured skepticism. His record states that he inspected the basement, noted the unusual door, and confirmed the latch was difficult to move. He attempted, unsuccessfully, to open the door himself. "Feels sealed from the other side," he wrote. The officer found no signs of forced entry or tampering elsewhere in the house, no footprints near the basement windows. There was no evidence that someone had entered the property overnight. He concluded the report with a recommendation. The family may wish to consult structural specialists. Basement door likely installed by prior owner. No indication of criminal activity. The officer left shortly afterward, satisfied that no immediate threat existed, but the unease remained. The wife's diary continues the narrative with increasing detail and increasingly frayed nerves. October 20th. Children complained of hearing tapping through the floor last night. Said it sounded like something knocking from underneath them. October 21st. He refuses to sleep. Keeps going to the basement door and touching the latch like he expects it to move again. October 22nd. Someone needs to help us. Something is wrong here. By now, the case had begun to form layers of diary entries capturing the family's subjective experiences, official reports documenting the observable details, and the Masons' recollections providing technical insight. Each layer supported the others. Each layer deepened the mystery. On the afternoon of October 23rd, a breakthrough came from an unexpected angle. The husband recalled that the home's original blueprints were rumored to exist in the Old Town Records office. The family decided to retrieve them, hoping the plans would explain the strange door. What they found instead would reveal the first indisputable fact about the basement door, something no one had yet dared to acknowledge. According to the original architectural drawings filed with the town, the wall where the door now stood had once contained a doorway, but that doorway had been bricked over. 14 years before the house itself was built. The discovery of the original blueprints should have provided clarity. Instead, it rearranged the entire logic of the structure into something that defied conventional architectural understanding. According to the documents stored in the town records office, the parcel of land had once been designated for a different residence entirely, a small farmhouse planned in the early 1920s but never completed due to the owner's sudden relocation. The blueprints from that abandoned project showed a cellar accessed by a steep stairway, and on the southern wall of the planned basement, an interior doorway leading to what was labeled simply as storage. No measurements, no description of what lay beyond, no indication of materials or purpose. A doorway in a house that was never built. The husband traced the lines with his finger, following the faint black ink on yellowing paper. The outline of the storage room ended abruptly, as though the architect had intended to expand the drawing later, but never did. Most unsettling of all was the note scribbled in the margin, likely by the architect himself. Access to be sealed before construction. No further excavation. That instruction was dated 14 years before the foundation of the Merritt home was poured, 14 years before any stones were laid, 14 years before any walls existed. And yet, the basement of the house built later contained a door precisely where that sealed-off access had been planned. The family brought the blueprints home, laying them across the dining table beneath the uneasy glow of the overhead light. The children had been sent to stay with neighbors for the evening. The husband, the wife, and the paper that refused to make sense formed a quiet triangle of tension. They cross-referenced measurements, checking whether the planned foundation aligned with their own. It did not, but the mismatch only deepened the mystery. The 1920s blueprint cellar was smaller by several feet. The walls were different. The support beams differed. But the location of the unbuilt doorway corresponded exactly to the impossible door in their own basement. When they brought out the house's finishing plans from the 1930s, the contradiction sharpened further. The blueprint from 1938, the very document that should have accounted for every element of the final structure, showed no door, no storage room, and no architectural reason for any break in the southern basement wall. It was a blank foundation, solid stone, the kind of wall that should not contain anything but its own weight. Two plans, two eras, two incompatible truths, and one door that belonged to neither. Later interviews with the building inspector confirm he examined both documents, tracing the discrepancy with a palpable discomfort. He told investigators he had seen oddities in old homes before: misaligned beams, abandoned chimneys, and inexplicable nooks left behind by rushed construction. But he had never seen two architectural plans contradict each other so aggressively, nor had he ever encountered a feature that appeared to belong to a structure that had never existed. What unsettled him most, he later said, was the handwriting on the 1920s blueprint. The insistence to seal the access before any house was built. Someone didn't want that doorway opened. Not then. Not later. Not ever. But someone had bricked it off. Someone had placed a door over it decades later. And someone or something had moved the latch. The couple contacted the town records clerk to ask whether any older surveys of the land existed, maps predating both sets of blueprints. A search produced a thin, brittle map from 1894, drawn by a surveyor who had cataloged property lines and natural features in the region. On that map, the parcel the Merritts now lived on was marked with a single symbol, a square cut into the earth, labeled only "Old Excavation." No house, no foundation, no structure, just a cut, a void, a place where something had once been dug out, then abandoned. According to the surveyor's notes, the excavation had already been partially filled by the time he arrived. No dimensions were provided. No commentary on its purpose. Just a reminder that what lay beneath the Merritt's home had a history longer than any blueprint could reveal. The wife's diary contains an entry that evening, written with a shaking hand. "We should not be living here. There was something beneath this land long before this house, something someone sealed away." Yet, she did not leave. Neither did her husband. Instead, they agreed to return to the basement with the blueprints in hand, hoping to understand whether the door's placement matched more precisely with the unbuilt design or with the current home's layout. They stood before the heavy wooden door once more. The air felt denser than usual, as though the very atmosphere resisted their presence. The bulb overhead flickered a single time, then returned to steady light. The husband held the 1920s blueprint against the wall, lining up the measurements. Perfect alignment. The doorway on the plan matched the door exactly. Not the modern structure, but the ghost of a house that never existed. The wife suggested marking the perimeter of the door with chalk, hoping to identify any shift that might occur overnight. They traced every edge carefully, the powdery white lines forming a thin border around the impossible shape. She recorded the moment meticulously in her diary. At 11:47 that night, the sound returned. The same deep, muted knocking, once, twice, and then a third time. This time it was followed by something new, a scrape, faint, slow, as though something on the opposite side had dragged across the interior surface of the door. The children, still staying with neighbors, were spared from hearing it. The couple, wide awake, did not move from their bed for over an hour. When sleep finally came, it was shallow and fitful. At dawn, they returned to the basement. The chalk markings they had drawn around the door showed something undeniable. The door had shifted. Not by much, barely half an inch on the left side, but enough to smudge the chalk, enough to create a small arc where the outline had been disturbed, enough to prove it had moved. Enough to make one thing clear. Whether the door was opening or something behind it was pushing outward, the sealed access did not want to remain closed. The chalk shift should have ended any debate. Whatever the husband might have rationalized before, temperature fluctuations, settling foundations, the unreliable tricks of fatigue, none of those explanations could account for a physical displacement of the door itself. The chalk did not lie. Something on the other side had exerted pressure. Something had pushed. The diary entry from that morning is sparse, written not in full sentences, but in fragments, as if the wife could no longer bear to articulate complete thoughts. Door moved again. Not wind. Not house settling. Pressure from inside? The question marks appear lighter, as though the pencil weakened in her grip. They contacted the local authorities a second time. This time, 2 responders were sent. One of them the same officer who had visited days earlier, the other a younger deputy who had not yet learned how to mask unease behind professionalism. Both inspected the chalk marks. Both confirmed the shift. The deputy pressed his hand against the door, then stepped back immediately. When asked what he felt, he answered carefully. Not heat, not cold, just wrong. The senior officer scolded him for the phrasing, but his report betrays a similar discomfort. Though written in careful, objective language, one line stands out in the file. I cannot determine the cause of movement. The door appears sealed from the opposite side. Recommend structural contractor. But the mason had already refused to return. When contacted, he declined politely, repeating, in a statement later shared with investigators, that he could not in good conscience continue work on something that defied structural logic. Instead of seeking more contractors, the husband decided they needed to understand the space behind the door. If no blueprint accounted for it, if no known structure explained it, then the only remaining option was that the space predated the house entirely. The couple retrieved the 1894 map again. The old excavation symbol sat in the approximate location of the contemporary basement, though the scale was imprecise. The husband wondered whether the door opened into the remnants of that excavation, a hollow left behind when the land had been disturbed decades before. They considered drilling into the stone beside the door to determine whether a cavity existed behind it, but the wife objected. Her diary does not explain why, only that she felt certain it would make things worse. It would not be the last time she expressed that feeling. On October 24th, the couple attempted a new approach. Sound mapping. The husband retrieved a mechanic's stethoscope from the garage, an old tool left behind by the previous owner. He pressed the disc against various sections of the wall, listening for the telltale echoes of open space. At first, there was nothing. Solid stone, dense, quiet, but when he placed the stethoscope along the seam where the chalk had smudged, he froze. Then slowly lowered the instrument and looked at his wife with an expression she later described as something between disbelief and fear. "There's breathing," he said. The diary elaborates on that moment with a kind of meticulous restraint, perhaps the only way the wife could bring herself to record it. Not human breathing, not animal, too slow, too even. Like air, moving through a place that should not have air. To verify what they had heard, they repeated the test. The breathing persisted. Not constant, intermittent, subtle, or rhythmic, in a way that suggested movement of air inside a contained space. A hidden chamber, a sealed corridor, a void of unknown depth. Something that inhaled and exhaled with a patience that felt older than the house itself. Overwhelmed, the wife wrote, "We are not meant to open this." Yet the door continued to shift. That evening, just past midnight, the couple was awakened by a noise unlike the knocks that had preceded it. This time it was a low, resonant thud, followed by a soft crack. When they reached the basement the following morning, the reason for the crack became clear. The surface of the door now bore a hairline fracture, thin as a thread, but unmistakable. Not splintered wood. This fracture cut against the grain, too straight, too controlled, as if something behind the door had tapped the wood with precision, testing its strength. The mason's earlier description that the door felt more like stone now seemed distressingly relevant. Wood did not fracture that way. The husband insisted they bring in someone with geological expertise. It was the first time the wife saw him frightened enough to rely on others. They contacted a retired geologist who volunteered with local historical projects. He agreed to examine the door, arriving late in the afternoon with a small hammer, a chisel, and a notebook. His reaction was immediate. After tapping various points along the door's surface, he announced that the density was inconsistent with any common lumber. Similar density, he said, might be found in petrified wood, but even that comparison felt weak. Petrified wood would not retain the tactile warmth of timber, nor would it generate the faint echo he heard when applying pressure. Most alarming to him was the fracture. Instead of splintering outward, the break folded inward, as though the force had come from within. If there is a cavity behind this, he told the couple, it's under pressure. Pressure from what? He could not say. He recommended sealing off the basement entirely until a full excavation crew could be brought in. But before any arrangements could be made, events escalated. According to the wife's diary, on the evening of October 25th, the house's electricity flickered for several minutes. The lights dimmed, brightened, then dimmed again. The basement bulb, bare and exposed, swaying slightly from the vibration of the furnace, pulsed in irregular intervals. Twice, the bulb went out entirely. But each time it returned, the door seemed subtly altered. The fracture widened by a fraction of an inch. The latch shifted a few degrees to the left. A faint imprint like a hand pressed gently from behind appeared on the wood surface, then faded, leaving only the impression of texture. The geologist, visibly shaken, declined to return. That night, the wife wrote the longest diary entry she would produce during the entire ordeal. Her words were shaky, but intentional. It is not a door, it is a boundary, and something on the other side is testing it. The testing continued. Near midnight, another sound, this one new, rose from the basement floorboards, a steady, slow dragging, as though something heavy moved along the unseen floor of a hidden corridor. And beneath it, faint but unmistakable, that same drawn-out breathing. Not panicked, not urgent, patient, intentional, almost expectant. The wife ended the entry with a final sentence. If this continues, it will not stay sealed. And she was right, because by the next morning the door had shifted nearly an entire inch forward, as though whatever lay behind it had begun to lean. By the morning of October 26th, the shift in the door was no longer subtle. The chalk outline they had drawn days earlier now floated a full inch behind the door's new position, an unmistakable displacement that could no longer be rationalized as thermal expansion or natural settling. The door had moved forward, not swung open. There were still no hinges, no gaps, no evidence of rotation or pivot, but pressed outward, bowing ever so slightly into the basement air, as though the space behind it had contracted or something inside it had awakened. The wife's diary describes her reaction succinctly. It is breathing against the door now. The husband, pale and sleepless, said nothing. He stood before the door for nearly 10 minutes, studying its surface with the fixed stare of a man who no longer trusts his own understanding of the physical world. Only when the wife touched his arm did he blink and step back. "We need to know what's back there," he whispered. But there was no safe mechanism to find out. They could not open it. They could not remove it. They could not fracture the wood or stone, or whatever else the material resembled. And now, with the door pushing outward, they could not even assume that remaining passive would keep the boundary intact. That morning, the couple made their first attempt to contact an academic institution. The husband called a university 2 hours away, reaching the Department of Geological Sciences. He explained that they had an anomalous structural feature in their basement. Dense material, unresponsive to drilling, exhibiting independent movement. He did not mention breathing. He did not mention the knocks. Even so, the secretary politely redirected him to a different department. The different department never returned his call. Meanwhile, the door continued its slow outward pressure. By afternoon, the hairline fracture had grown into a thin diagonal fissure stretching several inches across the upper panel. Not deep, but visible. When touched, it felt warmer than the rest of the door, as though the surface beneath retained some form of latent heat. The wife pressed her fingers to it only once. She withdrew instantly. "It feels like the inside of a living thing," she wrote in her diary. "Like something that has a temperature." She refused to touch it again. That evening, the couple made the difficult choice to bring the children home from the neighbor's house. Not because the situation had improved, but because everything they had experienced thus far had convinced them that leaving the children elsewhere created too many variables they could not control. "If the house is wrong," the wife wrote, "we should face it as a family." She did not specify what wrong meant. That night, just after the children were asleep, the sounds returned louder and more deliberate than ever. A long, dragging shift. A muted thud. Then a faint scraping, moving from one side of the door to the other, as though something behind it was feeling its boundaries, tracing the edges of its confinement. The wife and husband sat on the basement stairs, listening in the darkness. Neither spoke. Neither went closer. The breathing behind the door had grown deeper, slower, more rhythmic. It no longer sounded like the movement of air in a confined space. It sounded deliberate, intentional, alive. At 12:43 a.m., the basement light flickered, then steadied. The sounds ceased abruptly. In the silence that followed, the couple could hear the furnace ticking, the pipes settling, and the distant rustle of autumn leaves outside, but not the breathing. And it was the absence of the breathing, after so many days of its presence, that unnerved them most. At 1:19 a.m., the sound returned, but not from behind the door. This time, the breathing came from somewhere above it, higher, closer to the ceiling, as if whatever was behind the door had shifted its position vertically, pressing against a part of the unseen chamber's interior wall. The wife wrote later, "It moved upward. It is no longer on the floor." The next morning, the door had shifted again. Another half-inch forward. The fissure widened. A faint bulge now protruded from the central panel as though pressure from behind had increased, and the latch, which had remained stubbornly resistant for days, now hung slightly loose, angled downward, as if the force behind the door had begun pulling instead of pushing. The husband decided they needed help beyond tradesmen or local officials. He contacted a regional historical society, describing the anomaly as a hidden architectural feature discovered during routine inspection. He hoped someone might have records of the land before the 19th century map. Someone did. A researcher called back with enthusiasm, explaining that the society had several documents referencing subterranean structures in the region dating back to the late 1800s, mostly abandoned cellars, root storage pits, and rural retreat spaces used by early settlers. When the husband provided the exact location of their home, the researcher paused, then asked him to repeat the address. Then asked how deep the basement was. Then they asked unprompted whether they had discovered any unusual structural elements. When the husband hesitated, the researcher apologized, saying only that the property had a long and complicated history and that he would gather records for review. He promised to call back by evening. He never did. Instead, late that night, the wife heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, slow. She assumed it was her husband. But when she stepped out of the bedroom, she found him still in bed, sitting upright and pale, saying he thought she was the one walking. They checked the children, who were both asleep. They checked the empty house. The footsteps had faded downward toward the basement door. The wife wrote, "Whatever is behind the door is no longer waiting for us to open it. It is exploring the boundaries." The next morning, the door had moved again, this time not forward, but sideways, a subtle but undeniable shift of its left edge scraping faintly along the stone. And something else had changed. The chalk outline they had drawn days earlier was no longer fully intact. Portions of it had been smeared downward as if brushed by fingers dragging along the surface, human fingers, or something with the idea of fingers. The wife, trembling, documented this without embellishment. It touched the outside of the door. And that was the moment the couple realized the terrifying truth. The boundary was no longer holding. Whatever was behind the door was learning how to move it. And soon, it would figure out how to open it. By October 27th, the atmosphere inside the Merritt home had changed in a way no report, blueprint, or diary entry could fully capture. The air itself felt heavier, as though the house were holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. The children complained that their rooms felt smaller, though they could not articulate why. The wife noted shadows forming in corners that seemed to shift when she looked away. The husband grew increasingly withdrawn, spending long stretches of time standing at the top of the basement stairs, listening. He no longer seemed certain whether he hoped to hear something or feared the silence more. That morning, when the couple finally descended into the basement, they were confronted with a sight that forced them to confront the possibility that the door was responding not simply to pressure, but to awareness. During the night, the bulge in the door's central panel had grown. The fissure had widened, but most disturbing was the latch. It now hung completely loose, dangling from a single rusted screw at an angle that suggested not decay, but manipulation. The metal showed faint marks that were inconsistent with tools. Marks more akin to something gripping it from below, pulling downward with slow, deliberate force. The husband retrieved the damaged latch and placed it on the workbench. It tilted in his hand with a peculiar weight, as though it had absorbed the tension of whatever had strained against it. "It wasn't rust that loosened it," he said softly. "It was pulled." The wife refused to touch it. Around noon, an unexpected development occurred, one that would create the first documented external witness beyond the family and the earlier officials. A neighbor, an elderly man who had lived on the street since the 1940s, wandered over to ask why the family's porch light had been turning on and off during the night. The husband, not wanting to disclose the truth, offered a vague excuse about wiring issues. But before the neighbor left, he casually mentioned something that would become a pivotal detail in the expanding timeline of the case. "Funny thing," he said. "This property had trouble back in 1938 too. My father used to say the builders stopped working for a whole week because they found something in the cellar. Just stopped, packed up, and left." When the husband pressed him for details, the neighbor shrugged. They never said what it was. But the foreman wasn't the same after. "My father said he walked around looking like he'd seen something that didn't belong in this world." He tapped his temple lightly. "He said he kept hearing things in his sleep, like something banging under the floor." The husband and wife exchanged a glance they both later described as a moment of shared icy clarity. Whatever was behind the door, it had been there long before they arrived, long before the previous owner, perhaps even long before the house had been built. The neighbor departed, unaware that he had just confirmed the earliest known account of disturbance associated with the basement. That night, the wife took a drastic step. She placed a small tape recorder at the foot of the basement stairs, positioned so that it faced the door but remained out of reach of the shifting bulge. She set it to record continuously, then returned upstairs. At 2:14 a.m., something woke the couple simultaneously. Not a sound, at least not one they consciously heard, but a sensation, a pressure, as though the house itself had shifted slightly around them. When they went downstairs the next morning, the recorder was still running. The red light glowed steadily. The tape had captured just under 6 hours of audio. They played it. The first hour documented normal basement ambience, the hum of the furnace, the occasional crack of settling wood, and the faint creak of the upstairs floorboards. But then, somewhere around the 90-minute mark, a new sound emerged, a rhythmic pulse, not constant intermittent, spaced several seconds apart. At first, it resembled air moving through a narrow cavity. But as the minutes passed, the sound changed, deepened, took on cadence, became unmistakable, breathing, slow, measured. Close to the recorder, so close that each inhale carried a faint vibration, as though something pressed its face, or its mass, or its presence against the inside of the door. The breathing continued for nearly 20 minutes. Then came the sound that would haunt both the couple and every investigator who later reviewed the tape, a long, low scrape, rising in pitch, as though something heavy were dragged upwards along the inside surface of the door. And then 3 slow knocks. Not the muffled, distant knocks from earlier nights. These were clear, resonant, intentionally spaced. The recorder captured each with such clarity it was later described as like knuckles on hardwood. At the end of the 3rd knock, the breathing stopped. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Then, at the 2-hour, 43-minute mark, something even more chilling occurred. A whisper. Not words, not language. A vibration of air shaped into a tone that suggested intention, but not communication. As though something behind the door was trying to imitate a sound it had heard in the outside world, trying to speak without understanding speech. The husband stopped the tape, rewound it, played the whisper again. It was faint, almost theoretical in its softness, but undeniably real. A sound that carried the shape of thought without the clarity of meaning. The couple sat frozen for several minutes. Then the wife stood abruptly and said, "We need to leave the house." But the husband disagreed. He argued that leaving without understanding the nature of the problem would be reckless, and that they could not afford to walk away from something that might escalate in their absence. They debated until dusk. In the end, they compromised. The children would be sent away again to the same neighbor's house. The couple would stay. They wanted answers. They wanted an explanation. They wanted to understand what had been sealed behind that door for nearly a century and why it was trying to come out now. But the house had no interest in waiting for their consent. At 11:58 p.m., the basement bulb exploded. Shards scattered across the floor. The fuse box tripped, and from behind the door came a sound unlike anything they had heard before. Not a knock, not a scrape, not breathing. A deep, resonant shudder, as though something immense had pressed forward all at once, testing the limits of its confinement with sudden force. Then the sound stopped, and the door began to bow. A slow, visible outward curvature, as if something behind it had shifted its full weight against the boundary. The wife wrote a single line in her diary for that night. "It is trying to enter the house." And the next morning proved her right. Because when they entered the basement at dawn, the door was no longer flush with the wall. It protruded 3 full inches into the room. By the morning of November 4th, the door's outward bulge had become impossible to rationalize through any structural explanation. The wood had not cracked. It had not splintered. It had not bowed in the way that aging material typically warps. Instead, it curved outward in a smooth, disturbingly uniform arc, as though molded from within by steady, deliberate pressure. An architect later described it as behavior inconsistent with any known timber deformation pattern. But for the Merritt family, the significance was simpler and far more terrifying. Whatever was behind the door was pushing. The husband ran his hand across the bulge that morning, feeling the unnatural tension in the wood. The grain was tight, compressed, almost humming beneath his fingertips. He reported later that it felt warm. Not from proximity to the furnace, not from environmental factors. Warm in a way that suggested contact not with machinery, not with air, but with something alive. He withdrew his hand immediately. The wife stood several feet back, unwilling to come closer. Her diary entry for that morning reads, "It feels like a boundary meant to fail." Before either of them could speak, a sound rose from behind the door, soft at first, then unmistakable. A low, resonant hum, not unlike the deep vibration of someone exhaling through their throat. But what made the sound disturbing was not the tone itself. It was the change in the wood as the sound continued. The bulge subtly expanded and contracted as though responding to the vibration, as though breathing. The husband staggered backward, nearly tripping on the step behind him. The wife said nothing. She simply left the basement and went upstairs to call the contractor who had examined the foundation the week prior. When she described the new deformation, he hesitated on the other end of the line before saying, "Ma'am, if the door is pushing out that much, Something is on the other side applying force. I'd advise you to call someone else, structural engineers maybe. Someone who handles containment issues. Containment issues. That phrase would appear repeatedly in later archival summaries, long after the events of 1938, after the house had changed hands, and after the sealed room had been reburied under layers of municipal documentation. By mid-afternoon, the couple had gathered every document they had collected since the first inspector's visit. The basement sketches, the anomalous blueprints, the tape recordings, the photographs of the bulging door, and the witness accounts from neighbors who had mentioned the original builder's abrupt departure. They laid everything out on the dining table in chronological order, attempting to construct a coherent timeline. The earliest date that appeared in any record was June 1938, the month construction began. The builders lasted 12 days before abandoning the site. Work resumed a week later under a different crew with no documented explanation for the switch. No official report existed. No correspondence survived. But town hall records listed a short handwritten note entered into the construction log on June 18th. The handwriting was shaky, the words concise. Substructure anomaly identified. Workers unwilling to continue. The site requires reassessment. Below it, in a different hand, someone had written, "Proceed without further investigation." The wife stared at these two lines longer than the husband. She read them again and again, until the ink seemed to blur. Then she whispered, "They built the house anyway. They left it here. They sealed it, and then they left it for someone else to find." The husband began cross-referencing the inspector's diagrams with the county archives they had reviewed weeks earlier. Something began to emerge, something subtle but undeniable. A pattern. Every blueprint revision, every one, contained faint differences in the basement layout. The same wall was drawn slightly differently on each document. The angle of a support beam shifted. A crawl space appeared in one version and vanished in the next. And most alarming, the sealed door appeared in none of them until September 1938, 3 months into construction. It had been added after the fact. Not by architectural necessity, not to satisfy building code, but because something had already been found, long before the Merritts moved in. The couple consulted the 1938 municipal property map. The house stood on what had once been a boundary point between two estates' land that had exchanged ownership repeatedly over the previous century. One owner had gone bankrupt. Another had disappeared while traveling. There were no records for the parcel's original survey. The oldest property line document, dated 1861, contained only 2 words next to the parcel where the Merritt house now stood. Unstable ground. The wife closed the folder and said quietly, "Whatever is behind that door wasn't put there. It was found." That night marked the beginning of what the family later referred to as the pattern hours. At 11:15 p.m., the first knock occurred, slow, hollow, not seeking attention, but marking time. At 11:58 p.m., a deep vibration ran through the floorboards, traveling through the joists into the kitchen above. Dishes rattled. The chandelier swayed by half an inch. The wife grabbed the hallway banister to steady herself. At 12:23 a.m., the furnace shut off abruptly. Not from a malfunction, the power remained on. Every light in the house still glowed. Only the furnace died, the air falling instantly cold. And at exactly 1:07 a.m., the door shifted again. The bulge expanded, pressing a full 4 inches outward. They heard the sound first, then saw the movement. A slow, resonant creak as the wood strained against its frame. The husband scribbled notes into a ledger as each event unfolded. He charted the precise times, the durations, and the intervals between each occurrence. Later, these notes would be analyzed alongside the tape recordings and inspector reports. A county historian described the compiled data decades later as consistent with a repeating cycle of pressure, mechanical, environmental, or otherwise. It is, but the Merritts had no scientific terminology to soften the dread. They only had their senses, and their senses told them something was coordinating its movements. At dawn, the couple entered the basement once more. they found dust settled on the floor in a strange pattern. 3 parallel lines stretching from the far corner of the basement directly to the sealed door. The lines were perfectly straight, equidistant, and precise, as though something had been dragged, not from above, not from outside, but from beneath. The husband knelt to examine the marks. He noted that they were deeper near the door, as though whatever had moved had stopped just shy of reaching the threshold. The wife whispered behind him, "It's not pushing outward anymore." He turned. "What do you mean?" "It's waiting." This interpretation, subjective as it was, would later be considered one of the most chilling statements in the family's recorded history, because the pattern hours would continue, and the door would continue to change. But by November 6th, something else would change as well, something that shifted the investigation entirely. The sealed door began making noise in the daylight, not knocks, not breathing. A new sound, one that none of the earlier tapes had captured. A sound that resembled movement, slow, deliberate movement, as though whatever existed behind the door had begun to change its position, or worse, its shape. By November 8th, the shift from nocturnal activity to daytime intrusion marked a turning point in the Merritt case, one that investigators decades later would cite as the moment the phenomenon crossed from boundary violation into full environmental dominance. It began at 10:41 a.m., a time when the family had grown accustomed to relative quiet. The wife was in the kitchen organizing the archival documents they had retrieved from town hall. The husband was in the living room repairing a lamp the children had knocked over days earlier. The house was bright with mid-morning light, the kind that usually softened the edges of fear. Then it came, a slow, deliberate creak from beneath the floorboards, subtle at first, then heavier and resonant, carrying through the joists and into the walls. The wife froze, her hands hovering above the open folder of blueprints. She waited, hoping it had been nothing more than wood settling. But the sound repeated, louder this time, unmistakably rhythmic. A dragging motion, something shifting weight, something adjusting itself within a confined space. The husband hurried toward the basement stairs. The wife followed more slowly, dread tightening her throat. When they opened the basement door and began descending the steps, the sound intensified. It was not random. It was not accidental. It was directional. Whatever was behind the sealed door was repositioning itself. When they reached the bottom of the staircase, the basement was unnaturally cold. Colder than any furnace malfunction could explain. Their breath fogged faintly in front of their faces. Dust floated in thin streams through narrow bands of light. And there, from behind the sealed door, came a final scrape, long and low, and ending in a sharp upward hitch, as though something heavy had come to rest against the inner surface. The door did not move, but the air around it felt charged, dense. The wife described it later as a tension that pressed outward without sound. The husband took a single step forward. The wife grabbed his coat sleeve. "Don't," she whispered. He nodded. They retreated upstairs. Later that afternoon, they gathered the children, fed them early, and sent them again to the neighbor's house. The couple then spent the next several hours reviewing the tape recorder logs, the diary entries, the architectural inconsistencies, and the unexplained marks found in the basement dust. The wife arranged the documents into clusters. Construction-era anomalies, builder withdrawals, unexplained noises, structural distortions, witness recollections, and time-stamped disturbances. She noticed something the husband hadn't: a pattern. Each major escalation occurred precisely 48 hours after a prior event. The distorted latch, the first knocks, the breathing, the tape's whisper, the bulges expanding. Now, the movement. Everyone had fallen within a repeating window 47 to 49 hours apart. The phenomenon, whatever its nature, was cyclical. She circled the dates and drew a line between them. Her voice was quiet when she spoke the conclusion aloud. "There's another escalation coming. Tomorrow, sometime after nightfall." The husband did not argue. He had reached the same conclusion. At 7:16 that evening, another unexpected detail surfaced, this time from the neighbor who had mentioned the builder's withdrawal weeks earlier. He returned to the Merritt porch, holding an old notebook he had retrieved from his attic. Handing it to the husband, he explained that it had belonged to his father, a foreman who had lived on the street during the 1930s and kept meticulous notes on all nearby construction projects. The couple invited him inside and read the entries aloud. June 5th. Workers complaining of knocking beneath subfloor. Told them to ignore it. Possibly water pockets. June 7th. Noise again. Louder. Something scraping under the new frame. One worker refused to return to the site. June 8th. Floor vibration during foundation work. No machinery running at the time. June 9th. Told men to continue. They refused. Said something was pressing upward. June 10th. Began sealing off the corner of the basement. No further comment. June 11th. Noise ceased. Workers resumed briefly. June 12th. Door installed over substructure opening. No entry, no discussion. June 14th. Leaving site. Men refused to continue. The husband looked up from the notebook, his face pale. They knew, he whispered. They knew something was there, and they sealed it instead of investigating. The neighbor nodded, his expression troubled. My father never talked about it. Not once. That's how I know whatever he saw. It changed him. When the neighbor left, the couple sat in silence for nearly an hour. The house creaked softly in the wind. Somewhere upstairs, a cabinet door clicked open from the change in temperature. But beneath it all lurked another sensation, one that felt less like sound than memory, an awareness that the structure itself had been built around something older, deeper, and not meant to be disturbed. At 11:52 p.m., the escalation began. This time, there was no prelude of soft knocks, no gradual buildup of tension. The event arrived suddenly, violently, with a single, crushing impact that struck the sealed door from the inside. The sound reverberated through the house. The floor trembled beneath their feet. Dust sifted down from the ceiling in fine, trembling lines. A framed picture fell from the hallway wall and shattered on the floor. The husband grabbed the banister to steady himself. The wife clutched the edge of the dining table. Then came the second impact, heavier, closer, directed. This time, the bulge in the door expanded visibly half an inch in a single movement. The wife gasped. The husband stepped backward instinctively. The house fell silent again. For 7 seconds, nothing. Then, from behind the door, something new. A rhythmic scraping, slow and uneven, with long pauses between each stroke, as though something inside the confined space was shifting its limbs or repositioning its weight. The scraping continued for a full minute, then stopped, followed by a low, resonant thump, so faint it resembled a pulse. A beat. A slow, rhythmic pattern. It was the first and only time the family described the sound as biological. The wife whispered, "It's alive." The husband did not respond. He moved toward the basement entrance slowly, as though pulled by some grim obligation. He descended the stairs alone. When he reached the bottom, the sealed door stood bowed nearly 5 inches into the room. The wood strained visibly. The edges of the frame had begun to separate from the wall. A hairline crack had formed at the top hinge. A thin line of dust fell steadily from the seam, suggesting inward pressure that had reached critical levels. The air near the door was warm, warm in a way that suggested breath. He backed away and returned upstairs. They did not sleep that night. Instead, they sat at the dining table, staring at the stack of documents, blueprints, diaries, recordings, and witness accounts that had accumulated over weeks of investigation. The wife finally spoke at 4:12 a.m. The next escalation will break it. She was right. And what happened the next day, November 9th, would become the most widely debated, least understood event in the entire Merritt case. Because the sealed door did not simply bulge. It moved. The morning of November 9th began with a stillness so complete it felt deliberate. No distant scraping, no vibration in the joists, no shift in the air pressure that had characterized the preceding nights. The house felt almost hollow, as though emptied of its own sound. The Merritts woke early, both having drifted in and out of shallow sleep. They sat together at the dining table in silence. The papers and recordings lay spread out before them like the case file of an unsolved crime in which they themselves were implicated. There were no more arguments, no more theories, only anticipation dread sharpened into expectation. They both understood that the cycle they had mapped was nearing its peak. Something was coming, and the house was waiting for it. At 9:16 a.m., the first indication arrived. A soft click from the basement below, subtle, almost casual. But the couple recognized it instantly. It was the sound of the metal hinge shifting under tension, not from natural settling, but from active movement. A pulse of cold air followed, rising through the cracks of the basement door at the top of the stairs. The husband stood. The wife followed, slow and cautious. When they opened the door and descended the stairwell, they saw immediately that the sealed door had changed. The bulge was larger now, 6 inches at the center, and the surface bore fine fractures that had not existed the night before. Not splinters, not cracks. Lines, curving, branching lines that resembled stress fractures in bone. The air was warmer still. The concrete floor directly in front of the bulging door showed faint condensation, as though moisture was being pushed outward by warmth from the other side. The husband approached with the caution of someone entering the room of a sleeping animal. The wife stayed on the steps, half-turned, as if ready to flee. At 9:21 a.m., the second indication arrived, a deep, resonant creak, longer than the others, sustained, bending the wood outward as though something behind the door had shifted its full weight and begun pressing. They watched. They waited. Then it happened. The door moved, not bulged, not quivered, not strained. It shifted suddenly and violently, an outward displacement of nearly an inch in a single motion. The sound accompanying it was unlike anything they had heard. A low internal groan of compressed material torn beyond its limits. A grinding friction that did not resemble wood or metal. The wife cried out. The husband stumbled backward. A fine cloud of dust drifted from the doorframe and hung in the air like smoke. By 9:32 a.m., the decision was made. The husband retrieved the crowbar from the workbench, not to force the door open. Neither of them intended to cross the threshold, but to test whether the latch screws or frame could be reinforced. He never reached the door. The moment he came within 3 feet, the temperature rose sharply. A wave of heat rolled outward from the door's surface, bending the air in a faint shimmer. He dropped the crowbar instinctively as the metal became warm in his grasp. They left the basement again. This time, neither spoke. At 11:58 a.m., nearly the exact hour of multiple prior escalations, everything changed. The first impact hit with such force that the kitchen cabinets rattled. The basement floor shook in a wave-like movement that traveled up through the staircase and into the hardwood above. A glass fell from the counter and shattered. The second impact came only seconds later, this one sharper and more directed. The bulging door slammed outward so hard the frame cracked. A fissure opened along the right side of the door, a jagged seam 2 inches long. The wife screamed, but what came next was worse. From the inside of the door, through the fissure, came a sound. Not a knock, not a scrape, not a whisper. A voice, not human, not an animal. A drawn-out, trembling vibration shaped into the faint outline of a syllable, as though something behind the door was trying to mimic speech without ever having heard language clearly. It was followed by a second attempt, a low, elongated sound, shifting upward in pitch. A third sound came next, this time clearer, a single, broken word. Open. The word hung in the air, soft but undeniable. The tape recorder upstairs captured it perfectly. The husband and wife backed away from the basement stairs, terror rendering them momentarily unable to move. The word was repeated once, twice, in slightly different intonations each time, as though whatever was behind the door was practicing, trying, imitating. At 12:16 p.m., the hinge at the top of the door snapped with a violent metallic crack. The upper portion of the door sagged outward, held only by the bottom hinge and the warped frame. Dust billowed into the basement. The wife grabbed the telephone and dialed the operator, demanding the sheriff's office. But the call failed. The line was open. She could hear static, but no voice answered on the other end. At 12:23 p.m., the third hinge snapped. The top of the sealed door fell forward by several inches. A dark gap appeared along the top seam. A thin stream of warm air flowed through it, carrying an odor neither of them could identify, as though earth, dust, and something faintly metallic had been trapped for decades behind the barrier. The husband rushed to the basement door at the top of the stairs and slammed it shut. He locked the latch, pushed a chair under the knob, and braced his back against it. The wife stood behind him, shaking uncontrollably. From below came the sound of the sealed door bending further outward, a long, low groan as though the pressure behind it had reached near breaking point. The wife begged him to leave the house. He refused, whispering, "If we leave, it opens unchecked. We have to hold it." At 12:28 p.m., the final breaking point came. A deafening crack echoed from the basement. The bulging door tore partially free from the frame. A section of the wood, 6 inches across, splintered, clean through, and fell outward. Behind it was no visible object, no hand, no face, no form, only darkness, a darkness that pulsed with heat and a faint, rhythmic vibration. The tape recorder captured the moment with chilling clarity. A single exhale-like sound from within the newly created opening, slow, deliberate, almost relieved. Then, the voice repeated one final time, louder now, shaped more clearly, "Open." At that moment, the couple fled the house. They ran into the yard, across the property line, and into the neighbor's driveway. The neighbor called the sheriff's office. When deputies arrived 18 minutes later, the house was silent. The basement door had been blown fully outward, lying shattered across the floor. The sealed door behind it still stood, its surface barely fractured, warm to the touch. But whatever had pressed against it was gone. The gap in the door was wider now, revealing only darkness. Deputies reported a heat haze within the sealed space, and several noted a faint vibration emanating from the opening, like air moving in a cavern. The sheriff ordered the space barricaded and sealed. The Merritt family never returned to the house. In the official record, the event was described as a structural failure related to unstable subfloor conditions. But the documents stored in county archives tell a different story. The tape recorder, the notebooks, the fractured latch, the witness statements, the recorded word, and the door, now stored in 3 separate evidence crates, still warped outward, as though something had pressed against it for decades, waiting for a moment of weakness. To this day, the sealed space behind the door has never been excavated, not because authorities lack the means, but because no one has been willing to open it. If you want more long-form archival investigations into forgotten structures, sealed rooms, and the unsettling histories that lie beneath ordinary places, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next story.